Good morning, everyone. So, in March, I traveled to Beirut to facilitate a training for MCC partners from Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. I had been to Lebanon 5 years ago, and a lot has changed in that time. In 2019, the Lebanese economy started to collapse, and since then, the GDP, or the gross domestic product, has declined by 58%, which according to the World Bank is one of the highest contractions in the world. In October 2019, with the currency quickly devaluing and new taxes proposed, people gathered in the public square calling for a change in government. Art was created on the streets, teach-ins happened in abandoned buildings, tents for gathering and visiting were erected, teachers brought students to the center of the city to show them what civic responsibility and leadership accountability could look like. A new government was formed, but the political situation continues to be tumultuous to this day. And then the global pandemic, and then in August of 2020, there was an explosion at the port of Beirut, which destroyed neighborhoods, many buildings, and killed more than 200 people. I was told that people thought they were being bombed and that a war with Israel had begun again. I had read about all these changes as I prepared for my trip to Lebanon. But even if I hadn't, I would have quickly learned about these significant events that brought stress and tension and harm, because as I traveled from the airport to the hotel, I saw monuments and signs and street art acknowledging these experiences. As I met with MCC partners, we talked about how these memorials and public acknowledgements are important for communities who are seeking justice and healing and right relationship. They are helpful tools to name both harm and hope. And we will spend the next few weeks exploring what public acknowledgements means in our context here in Saskatoon. In January, at our semi-annual meeting, the following statement was read. At Wildwood Mennonite Church, we have done and are doing the work of reconciliation in many different ways. Several years ago, we hung a red dress at the front of the church as a reminder of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It is currently hanging in the coat rack. We regularly offer prayers for truth and reconciliation during the worship service. On our bulletins, we make a land acknowledgement, and recently there's a land acknowledgement slide at the beginning of our services, and that is read by our worship leader. As a congregation, we have learned about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, and we've invited Steve Heinrichs, who is the MC Canada Indigenous Settler Relations Coordinator, to come teach us about Indigenous rights. We have signed on to support legislation around UNDRIP. We have also used our community funds to support reconciliation events, such as those hosted by Reconciliation Saskatoon. To continue this work of reconciliation and put forth our intention of how we want to continue and do this work as a community, Church Council would like to invite the congregation into a process of developing a treaty land acknowledgement that we could publicly display. In a workshop on land acknowledgements, Stryker Calvis, an Indigenous educator, invited participants to build a relationship with the statement they want to make, and this is what we would like our church to undertake in these coming months. We then gave you some questions and had you talk in small groups, and these are the things we heard. We still have lots to learn. We need to educate ourselves, especially around Indigenous spiritual practices. We need to be aware of the Savior complex. We don't want this to be an empty gesture. We want to hear from Indigenous voices during this process. There were questions. What can we really do with the knowledge that there has been so much harm? What do land acknowledgements need to focus on? Are land acknowledgements actually important to Indigenous people? How are they connected to things we must learn and unlearn? And how will they be connected to practical land and treaty work like reparation and land back movements? And we heard some suggestions. Let's include the earthiness of the land. We could post it outside for others to see. The plaque could show a map of Treaty 6 with numbers referring to the reserves, and each reserve could represent one dot, and one dot could represent our church. We could install Indigenous art outside. And if we have a plaque inside, we should make it movable so that it isn't static. These are good things to hear, and they have informed some of our plans for this coming month, my sermon today, and I hope you keep these ideas and questions in your mind over these weeks as well, and I assume and hope more questions and ideas will arise. Now, you may think, this is all good, summary is nice, but that scripture about kings was sort of left on a cliffhanger. What happens to Naboth? So, let's find out. Do you guys just play it now?
It's time for a Bible story. This story is about a guy named Naboth.
Oh, bless you.
What? No, I didn't sneeze. I said Naboth.
Oh, allergies getting you, huh? You need a Kleenex, bud?
No, I'm not sneezing. I'm saying his name, Naboth.
Oh, gotcha. Continue.
Naboth lived a long time ago in the land of Israel. He was a godly man that lived a nice, quiet life on some land.
Aw, he seems nice. I like this little Nablers guy.
You mean Naboth?
Yeah, that's what I said. Mayberth.
I think you're saying it wrong. His name was Naboth.
Oh, bless you.
Never mind. Naboth lived on a piece of land that was right by the king's palace.
Nice. That's a pretty sweet setup. Good location, property value going through the roof. He's living the dream.
Well, there is a catch. The king that lived in the palace was named Ahab, and he was not a great dude. And the queen wasn't any better. Her name was Jezebel. Together, they were a pretty dastardly duo.
Uh-oh, I got a bad feeling about this. Okay, so what's the deal? They were just like bad neighbors or something? Always playing loud music, leaving their trash all over the place?
Not quite. You see, Naboth had a bit of a green thumb.
Oh, what? Gross. What's wrong with his hand? That's nasty.
No. That's just a phrase that means he was a gardener, that he liked working with plants, not like he actually had a green thumb.
Oh, okay, good. 'Cause that'd be weird.
Naboth had a beautiful vineyard on his land. It was full of lush plants, and Naboth worked really hard to make it very fruitful. His vineyard was so beautiful that it caught the eye of someone very powerful.
Let me guess. The Hulk.
What? No.
Superman?
Wrong again.
Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
No, it was King Ahab. He saw Naboth's vineyard from his palace and wanted to have it for himself. So he asked Naboth if he could buy it. But Naboth said no.
Huh, how come?
That land was given to Naboth as an inheritance, and God told him never to sell it. So he thanked the king and declined his offer.
Okay, no big deal. Just gave him the old, "it's not for sale."
Well, it shouldn't have been a big deal, but it was to King Ahab. He was furious that Naboth didn't give him what he wanted, so he went away pouting and all upset.
Wait, like he threw a fit? Like a little baby?
Pretty much, yeah.
Man, that guy's got a screw loose or something. Let me get this straight. He's a king.
Yep.
And he lives in a totally awesome palace. But he's throwing a temper tantrum because he didn't get something? Oh, that sounds like little King Baby needs a whittle nappy time.
You're not wrong. And when Queen Jezebel heard that Naboth wouldn't sell his vineyard to the king, she got super mad too.
Seriously? What a couple lame-o babies.
Totally. But it gets even worse. Queen Jezebel was so angry about it that she did something really awful. She had Naboth killed so her and King Ahab could steal the vineyard for themselves.
No, Naboth, are you for real?
Unfortunately, yes. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel let their jealousy consume them, and it eventually led to their own destruction. God had such better plans for them, but because they let their hearts be hardened and gave in to sin, it caused their entire family to be wiped out.
Man, that is crazy. Okay, do me a favor. Remind me if I ever see a vineyard that I really like, but I can't have it, like not to get super jealous and like kill the people that have it to steal it from them, because that is not going to end well for me at all.
Sure thing. If that ever happens for some weird reason, I'll totally remind you.
Thanks, man. You're the best.
The end.
In Stories of Repair, a reparative justice resource toward dismantling the doctrine of discovery, Katrina Friesen, who's a pastor and educator from California, notes how this story, found in Kings, has been lived out in history and continues today. She says, to Naboth the peasant farmer, this vineyard was not private property. His land holds a deeper meaning of a gift, sacred land in trust from Yahweh. In Hebrew, it is nahala, ancestral inheritance passed down through kinship ties over generations. Naboth is the protector and caretaker of the nahala. Yet King Ahab attempts to commodify the nahala and offers a price for Naboth's beloved ancestral territory. The king's negotiations and Naboth's persistent refusal to sell reveal a deep difference in worldview between land as ancestral gift and land as a resource to be possessed. This difference of worldviews is something I am noticing more and more in my reconciliation work. For example, within the Christian church, we talk about how we are stewards of the land, caretakers. Jared talked about this last week. When listening to Indigenous teachers, I hear them often talk about being of the land. I had always done a cultural translation when I heard we are of the land to be the same as stewards of the land. It wasn't until I was explicitly told, no, that is not what we mean, that I heard the difference. I know what it means to care and respect and love the earth. I don't know what it means to feel like I am actually part of the earth or one with the land. I might never know that. But I can start to create a space for those different understandings to sit together rather than translating the difference into something that makes the most sense for me and makes me feel comfortable. Over the past 5 years, Christian institutions have started making land acknowledgments. That is what we are talking about today, and apologies for harm that has happened in the past. This truth-telling is an extremely important and essential part of reconciliation. Yet I still sit with the extremely uncomfortable truth that while we are making these apologies and acknowledgments, we are living in Naboth's vineyard and eating his family's grapes. And the Naboths of the world are still being pushed off of their nahala, their ancestral lands. Systems and traditions still benefit the people who settled this land more than Indigenous people. For example, in Saskatchewan, there are 6 long-term drinking water advisories on reserves, and across Canada, there are 52.5 of these advisories that have been in place for more than 10 years. In the 2016 census, in Saskatchewan, there was 16% of the population that identified as Indigenous, but there are 75% of Indigenous people incarcerated. In 2017, only 8% of Indigenous people between the ages of 25 and 64 had university degrees, compared to 23% of non-Indigenous people. These discrepancies are largely created by unjust and discriminatory systems that benefit white settlers. One aspect that I think perpetuates these injustices is the myth of meritocracy. Dr. Sheila McLean is an anti-racist scholar and one of the co-founders of the Idle No More. And she speaks about this in an article she wrote called, "We Built a Life from Nothing." Dr. McLean describes that as a young white girl growing up on the prairies, she would hear stories of the hardships her grandparents endured when they first arrived in Canada. She describes one narrative that stands out as particularly important, which was that her grandparents immigrated to Canada with little money or goods. It was not until many years later that she came to understand these narratives reproduced the idea that her collective family wealth and status as white settlers was earned through resourcefulness. McLean states, "These family stories are national texts that position white settlers as having earned social and political status in society through intelligence and hard work alone, erasing the colonial policies that enforced differential access to resources such as land. The story that my family built a life from nothing works to make economic inequality between white settlers and Indigenous people seem natural and normal." This can all seem pretty serious. Sue Parker, who is the denominational minister for transformative peacemaking for the Mennonite Church USA, and Erica Littlewolf, who works for MCC and is Northern Cheyenne, published a conversation they had about acknowledgments and decolonization. And I want to read part of that conversation. So first, Erica is talking about acknowledgments. We're always taught about acknowledgments since we were kids. We go into a space and we're taught acknowledgement because it's how you recognize relationships. When you're a little kid, your parent or whoever is older than you might be like, Erica, this is your auntie. And you might be confused about how this is your auntie, and then they'll explain. And then you'll shake their hand. And then it's on to the next one. They'll explain your relations, and you're acknowledging everyone. You might take people on as your grandma, even if you're not related. Ever since you're little, you're taught how to do this. And I think that's where land acknowledgements come from. It's an indigenous way of being. It's interesting how white people have done that, where they kind of take it and they make it sound like someone's died. And it's not like that. The tone they get, it's like it's a funeral and they're reading a eulogy. I realized maybe I should start explaining land acknowledgements to white folks this way. You're undoing the concept of terra nullius, the idea that no one existed on the land. Terra nullius is this idea of empty land because people here weren't Christians. You're giving acknowledgement back to the land and saying, no, indigenous people have always been on this land. And we do away with this idea of terra nullius. We do away with the idea that only Christian people matter. This is the value of these words. You're undoing all of this as Christian people when it was first said by a Christian entity. So say it like that, not like all sad and mopey, you know? Say it with power. Say like, hell yeah, we're undoing this terra nullius. Sue responds, I love your idea of land acknowledgements being less somber. It is an act of resistance and reclaiming a fuller story of the land and those who inhabited it. I mean, think about the history of this land. The history, pain, suffering, resilience, joy, there are all kinds of stories here. Let's acknowledge and honor this land that has taken it all. This month, we will look at how we want to do our best acknowledging and honoring this land here, with its complicated past, with our complicity in harms, with our hope for the present and the future in the best ways we can figure out now, knowing that our understanding will shift and we will come back and make changes and clarifications or redirections. So what will this month look like? The next 2 Sundays, we will be hearing from Indigenous community leaders, Lyndon Linklater and Harry LaFond. And then on the 22nd, we will meet at Waniskewan to do church on that sacred land through prayers and walks and reflections. And then on the 29th, we will come back here together to set down our words and visions for our public acknowledgement. This will not be the end of our reconciliation journey, but it is an important step in that direction. Sarah Augustine is a Tewa descendant who attends Seattle Mennonite Church, and she reflects on Psalm 24, 1-2. This verse reminds us that the earth is not owned by any particular being, especially humans. Our Creator God formed the earth to be co-inhabited by all God's created beings. As a result, concepts of land ownership, such as private property or exploitation of the earth, are inherently contrary to God's plans and designs for creation. As the church, where do we stand? Do we stand with the logic of death, extraction, private property? Or do we stand with the logic of life? Psalm 24:1 makes the choice clear. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. The earth does not belong to us. The earth and her creatures belong to God in kinship and covenant relationship. They are not ours to own and control. The only faithful choice is to stand with the logic of life in relationship with God's creation. Amen.